and Wendy Laird and Helen Ingram are interviewing Bob Varady. Bob, we're interested in how you got involved in the border area, what brought you to this. Was there something early on in either your academic experience or your childhood that brought you to the desert? So what's your history and how did you arrive here?
It was my academic childhood, I suppose you could call it. But it was really Helen, because up until 1984, when I was at the Office of Arid Land Studies, my interests were really purely international. I had run projects in Yemen and in West Africa, and I was about to do a big project in Mauritania. And I really didn't have any experience in our own region in looking at desert arid issues. And then what happened was there was a fellow at the Office of Arid Land Studies whose name was Jonathan Taylor. You probably remember him, Helen. Jonathan Taylor, who was a geographer. And he had just recently gotten a contract from the Arizona Department of Health Services to try to convene a conference looking at the Great Triangle on the U.S.-Mexico border, a little bit southeast of Tucson. And the issue was that there was a new smelter being built in Mexico to complement the two existing very old smelters, 1890s era smelters, and that this new smelter was going to be built without any pollution controls. And so a number of people, notably some NGO types in Arizona, were very upset at that. And they began making noises, and one thing led to another. They got to EPA, and EPA provided some money to the State Department of Health Services to convene a big meeting at which all of the interest groups would be represented. And what happened was that just as the contract was being inked, John Taylor left. And so the head of the office, Ken Foster, came to me and asked if I'd be interested in taking it over. And those were before the days that I'd learned not to worry about being presumptuous. And so I said to him, but Ken, I know nothing about this area. You know, like if you want me to talk about India or Niger or someplace like that, I'm really good, but I don't know anything about this region. He said it didn't matter because he knew that I had good organizational skills. So that was in June of 1984. And we began planning for this event that eventually took place in January or February of 1986. Helen was one of the PIs, and there was an organizing committee, and we brought together a lot of people with whom we've stayed in touch, people like Roberto Sanchez, and Dick Camp, of course, he was the one whose outrage initially got everyone excited about this. And so we began organizing this meeting, which took place, and the big revelation, I think, to all of us was that the university was able to put people in a big room together who otherwise wouldn't have talked to each other, people from Phelps Dodge and other mining interests, and people from the environmental radical wing, as well as more environmental moderates and academics, people who had done research on sulfur dioxide deposits in the desert, things of that sort, agriculturalists. And when we took stock of what happened, it turned out it was a very successful model for postulating that universities had a role to play in active, ongoing environmental issues in our region, and that we could be useful simply by being a convener, a facilitator, and that we had credibility with all of the sides, and that we were able to get academics to bring their research and put it on the table so that the opposing sides could look at it. So when we took stock of all of that, and a few months after the event ended, Helen said to me, you know, we could be doing the same sort of thing on water. And I have some good contacts over at the Ford Foundation, and they might be interested in something like that. So at that point, this was by now the spring, late spring, early summer of 1986, we contacted Ford, and they said, well, get us a white paper and we'll see what we can do. And we began sitting down with Nancy Laney and some other people and Simon Inge in hydrology, putting down some ideas and sending them to Ford, and they would send back comments. And then next thing we knew, it got to be 1988. So it was like 2 years later, and we still didn't have any action. And the guy who was the program officer at Ford left. So we got stuck with this project that he had urged on and, encouraged, and then he disappeared and there was no track record of anything. But luckily, Helen had good relations with the person who ran the poverty division at Ford, Norm Collins, and he said, okay, why don't you guys do this? Why don't you reconstruct the events that led up to here, how we encouraged you, and let's take another look. And lo and behold, in the summer of 1989, which was about 6 months after Helen got to the center, to the Udall Center, and by the way, all of this took place before there was a Udall Center, the origins of this. And then I came in July of 89, and in August of 89 we got the contract, which set the Udall Center on its now 21-year journey to look at water environment in the U.S.-Mexico border region. So that was my introduction to it, and I've been on that trip ever since.
Why did you go into arid land studies? What was that?
Well, that was a whole other genesis. What happened was that I had just completed my dissertation in 1981, and it was on South Asian history, and I was looking at transportation systems and environment and agriculture, and there were, I like to ask people, I defended my dissertation in May of 1981. I say to people, do you know what happened in January of 1981? And they go, ooh, Reagan? That's it, Reagan. Well, Reagan happened in January of 1981, and at that moment, all the floodgates just shut on most humanistic social sciences openings at universities. So there was no hope of pursuing that. And just then, somebody at Arid Lands that I knew was involved in a project for the Man in the Biosphere program, doing environmental profiles of developing countries. And they recruited me to do one on Pakistan, which I knew very well because I had lived there for a while. So one thing led to another, and I wound up making that into a 10-year stay at the Office of Arid Land Studies and getting introduced much more to hardcore environmental policy and developing country agricultural type issues.
Well,
and so it was from there that I came to the Udall Center.
I'm thinking that no one else in this that we've interviewed knows anything about the Ambos Nogales project. Which
That's
is
probably true.
We were thinking about interviewing Sherry Sass and then kind of bringing it up to date to the other things you've done. I think that might be helpful.
Okay. Well, the Ambos Nogales project was the project that we came up with as the sequel to the air quality smelter project, and that was the one that was initially funded by the Ford Foundation. And essentially what we were trying to do at the start was to look at how water was being managed in a binational setting where there were two towns that were right next to each other that were not separated by a wall or a fence at the time. There was a fence, but it was penetrable and it wasn't anything like the current wall. And we'd been hearing rumors that relations between the governments and the populations were quite cordial, unlike other places in the border, and that there had been a tradition of collaboration across that border on issues like fires and water provision, drought, and things like that. So that got us interested. And we designed this project that had several different prongs where, on the one hand, we were trying to look at what were the formal and informal linkages for dealing with water issues. And at the same time, we got convinced by our activist friend Dick Camp to look at potential pollution issues that were being caused by maquiladora activity in the Mexican side of Nogales, Sonora. And so he convinced us to add a water quality testing component to the project that was not written into the original proposal. But it turned out to be very useful because what it did is it enabled us to get people from the official water community in Arizona, the Department of Water Resources, together with their counterparts in Sonora, again via academics, via hydrologists, particularly via Simon Inge, who had a long time interest in Mexico and had a joint appointment at one of the universities there. So what we did is we facilitated a process where there were samples being taken by a joint team of Mexicans and US people adhering to set protocols, and then we were able to look at the results and put them into a big document that we made available, and those are still available, and they're now of historical value. And when we did that, we realized at the same time another thing that was not in the proposal, that a lot of this stuff, all of it really had spatial components. And so wouldn't it be interesting to try to put that onto a GIS? And so we began working with people in Arid Lands, Stuart Marsh and his group, to create a GIS for all of the information. Because one of the things we'd been looking for was what was the existing network of pipes on both sides of the border, and what areas were connected and which ones weren't, particularly on the Mexican side, because the landscape was changing so quickly due to the maquiladora process that there were new neighborhoods being created almost every year, and these neighborhoods, it was obvious, were the places where the workers would go, and they set up shacks and cardboard tents and whatnot, and those areas were not served by any infrastructure. So it was interesting to get maps from the city administrations of where the pipes were, not only the delivery pipes, but the sewage pipes, and to have those mapped. And we think what we did at the time was the first cross-border GIS that had information in comparable scales on both sides of the border. Those still exist, and in fact, I've been meeting with a number of people. That information has been resurrected by Lauren Norman, and I don't know if you've met her, but she's somebody that you should put on your list. She's a PhD from the School of Natural Resources and Environment, who now works at USGS, and she's done a lot of work mapping colonias on both sides of the border, work funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and she's now working on an environmental health project, and she's a GIS person. So she's actually incorporated some of our GIS stuff from 1989 to 1993 into a much newer thing, and we're trying to set up a meeting with Francisco Lara, who's still in the picture, and he's another guy that you should probably add to your list. He's now at ASU in the planning department. We just saw him. He came to a meeting that we had in Hermosillo 3 weeks ago. So he's very interested. I think he still has some of the raw data that I've tried over the years to resurrect that project and funded a number of people to try to put the two things together, and it just hasn't happened. But I'm still hopeful, because what I like about it is that data is now 20 years old, and it has historical value. It's like longitudinal, because things have changed. Infrastructure has changed, and water quality testing, if it were done again, would yield different results. So that project really put us on a track to continue working on those kinds of issues. And one thing led to another, and before we knew it, we had about 10 different projects from the Ford Foundation between then and about 1998, so about 2 years after Helen left. That was when the Ford Foundation and most of the other foundations decided that there were greener pastures elsewhere, and they pretty much stopped funding research on the border.
Might be useful to say a little bit about our Mexican collaborators.
Yes. Well, one of them was Francisco Lara, and he at the time ran the Nogales office of El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, COLEF. And of course, his close collaborator and his co-principal investigator was Roberto Sanchez, who at the time, up until about 1995, was the director of environmental and urban programs at COLEF, based in Ensenada, so Tijuana, Ensenada. And they had their own grant from the Ford Foundation. I never quite knew how large theirs was. I don't think it was as large as ours, but...
Remember, we insisted that they have a separate grant.
We did, and both sides tried to insist that we merge our data, but it didn't happen. They wound up using a different GIS program, not ArcInfo. We used ArcInfo. And in the end, the two databases never truly got merged into a single one, which was a shame.
Although I think we learned some things about building trust and cooperation in that project. Is that something you want to...
Well, I think so, because, I mean, we felt that we had a really good working relationship with them, and...
but it had to do with treating them like equals.
We treated them like equals. We hired graduate assistants on both sides. They worked together. In fact, one of the people we hired was the son of Jorge Bustamante, if you remember.
That's right.
The young kid at the time was just in college somewhere in California. So it was an exercise in that, in building trust with a Mexican institution who was a co-equal in the process. And that led to forming a similar relationship with the Colegio de Sonora in Hermosillo, with Catalina Denman, who I saw was on your list, and her group. And Catalina, of course, went on to become the rector of that university. She's now stepped down from that. And we're still enjoying very good relations with that university. Our relations with COLEF dried up, mostly because COLEF closed their office in Nogales at around, 1998 or so. Now it's open again, but it's not what it used to be. It's not really a research center. Whereas what we did is we found a new colleague at the Colegio de Sonora, Nicolas Pineda, who is a water policy person who got his PhD at the University of Texas. And he's been a very good collaborator. I've involved him in 3 of my projects looking at water and climate in the border region, and he's been very good. He's been very forthcoming, very collegial, and really a good friend.
One of the outgrowths of that Ford money was also the RED, remember that?
La Red, right, it was. Although it was not the outgrowth so much of our Ford money. That was money that Dick Camp got together with Catalina and Rosy Caudillo. So they formed a network, which at the time was quite unusual. It was a network on environmental and health issues for this part of the border. And I think Ford had great expectations for it, and I think as sometimes happens, you get the wrong person in the position. And I think you remember Rosie, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, she turned out not to be as good an administrator as she was whatever she did, a sociologist, I think, or PR. But in the end, the administration undid her, and she wound up having to leave, and the organization never recovered until I think it got resurrected some years later. But at the time, in the late 90s, it was really pretty effective at getting people, particularly on the Mexican side, tuned in to some of the issues, the environmental, water-related, health-related issues. And that was also tied into another organization that Dick Camp helped create, which was that Northeast Sonora Southern Arizona Coalition that was partly led by him on the U.S. side, and Gildardo Acosta. You remember him, and he passed away. Did you know that, Helen?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he passed away in 2004 of cancer. And Miguel Angel Gonzalez was the other person.
Yes.
And that group was also quite effective at the time in getting people interested specifically in environmental health issues in the Douglas area of southeastern Arizona, northeast Sonora.
I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about the involvement that you had with BEC and NADBAC and the ideas.
Actually, when I was looking at your first question here, I sketched something out because you said what stages or events stand out as turning points in the story and why. We haven't really said what the story is, but if you want to think of the big picture of the story, which is what I think you're getting at, like what has been the evolution of border environmental work and border environmental politics more writ larger. The way I see it is, well, predating my interest, but not by much, was the La Paz Treaty in 1983. And interestingly, I've got a colleague who was just here 10 days ago. He's the one who had me invited to Wisconsin. He's at Wisconsin. His name is Samer Alatout. He's a Palestinian who's involved in my other Palestinian-Israeli water project, but it turns out that he married someone from Douglas. And so he's got a strong interest in the border, and he's a really good scholar. He's in their Department of Community and Environmental Sociology and at the Nelson Institute of the Environment, which is who I did the lecture for. And he's gotten interested in this part of the border, and of all things, he wants to work on this kind of thing, on border walls and so on. So, this is an ongoing, it's an expanding field where not only people from Tucson are interested in this. But when I started talking to him about this, he said, what I'd really like to do is a history of what happened what led up to the La Paz Treaty and what happened since then. So that is what he's going to write on. I've put him in touch with Paul Ganster and tried to put him in touch with Cliff Metzner, who at the time was the U.S. Author of the La Paz Treaty. And Paul doesn't know what happened to Cliff, because Cliff used to work for Paul Ganster at San Diego State. And of course Alberto Secoli, who was just at the meeting that Peggy was at Irvine. So Alberto is the other key person because he was the Mexican. So that was the beginning of really the consciousness, the first government stirrings outside of IBWC having anything to do with environment. The next thing, of course, was NAFTA. And that came into being in early '94, in January '94. And for us, it was it was a gift. It was a gold mine, because we had been talking about the advent of a free trade agreement for a couple of years before. And when it happened, it came with these new institutions that we convened a group here in the conference room of the Udall Center with Al Utton and all kinds of Steve Mummy and Roberto Sanchez and Mary Kelly, and a fairly large group of about 15 people. And the outcome was a white paper that was very brief, but it called for a new environmental commission called the IBEC, the International Border Environmental Commission. And it had some of the ideas that wound up percolating into, not so much into CEC, but into BEC. And so when BEC was created, it was a beautiful thing to watch the thing come into being, particularly since it bore some of the hallmarks of what we were trying to push here, which was public participation and transparency and openness and attention to sustainability. So we began to treat that as a research topic while it was in action. And then we got some money from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, in addition to the money that we were getting from Ford, to sort of help BEC along, to help guide them. And we put out a newsletter just on BEC. We attended all of the board meetings every 3 months, wrote about them. And in 1995, so it's now been 15 years, we began BECnet right here. That was an idea I had of putting up a listserv, which in those days was, not quite as mundane as it is these days. And it wasn't really a listserv as such. It was more of a forum where people actually engaged in the articles that were being discussed, and new forms for proposal generation, and everything that came up with BEC. There was a strand of discussion on BECnet. And the amazing thing is, I don't know if you know this, Helen, that not only is it still going, and it became, by 1997, it was already the quasi-official site for BEC, where they would put into their regulations that things need to be posted on BECnet 90 days before they come up for vote, or stuff like that. But not only is it still running, But the way the university runs these listservs, there is an archive of every single message posted on BECnet, organized month by month. So if I keep telling graduate students, if you want a data gold mine, there are the BECnet archives that from January or February of 1995 contain, organized month by month, every message that's ever been posted, right up to today. Then a year later, in the spring of '96, we created CECnet, which has the same archive. Every message ever posted on CECnet is still there, available for people. So for us, the beginning of these institutions was really perfect, because for a public policy center like this that had focused its attention just on this region, suddenly there were these new institutions that, in a fashion, we helped come into being, we helped shape, and here they were taking form, and we were able to watch them and observe them.
I'm curious as to why. It sounds like there was a real shift in the way the university was engaging in this region, and we've heard that from others, Tom Sheridan and others. What changed the university's opportunities in that?
It's funny you say that, because I wouldn't necessarily have said the same thing. I mean, I think that we at the Udall Center were the ones who were doing this kind of community involvement, working with NGOs, treating public policy as something of a theater to watch and write on at the same time that we were helping to shape it. And I didn't see that many other people on campus.
Not that so much as Tom sort of likened it to, researchers used to go to Mexico, grab stuff, and bring it back.
I see.
But there was a sea change in the way that relationship evolved, and it became collaborating with researchers in Mexico and universities actually interested in the archaeology and the culture. And there was a change in the tenor between them going in, rather than them just coming in.
Yeah, I don't know that I was aware that that was happening. I would put that into a much larger context, that after the 1960s, really beginning in the 70s, academia in general became more sensitized to that whole issue. So for example, when I did my dissertation work in India, one of the things I kept hearing is that all of these US and British scholars would descend on India, do their research, then disappear, and there would never even be a copy of the dissertation or the book in India. And I think the more you heard that, and scholars did hear it, the more sensitized they became for the need to really collaborate equally. And with Mexico, that was, notwithstanding the history, the rough patches in history, it was easier to do that with Mexico than with Libya or India or something like that.
There was another strain in this conversation it's worth mentioning, and you're right, that was certainly one of them, and that was that the university used to have a strong commitment to a sense of place. And here, I think they're talking about John Schaefer's commitment to Bunny Fontana and to Big Jim Griffith and that kind of thing. And that sort of indigenous representation of our region as a laboratory, and trying to increase the visibility of research in the region. I think particularly the biologists now feel that molecular biology may be more important. But I don't know if that really affects the public policy side, or do you think it does?
I don't know. This makes me think of something that you'll remember, Helen. When I first got to the Udall Center and Judy Temple was just leaving, I think we overlapped for about 2 weeks, one of the things she said to me was that there were two kinds of people on the Udall Center organizing committee, the takers who always had their hands out, and the other people. And I guess I feel that way more generally, that if you're waiting for the administration to do something for you, whether it's to declare that your thing is a priority or that, this sense of place is important or not important, you're going to be waiting a long time. And I don't believe in that kind of thing. When I do something, I think you should just do it And if you're successful, you'll convince the people who need to be convinced, you'll get the funding, and you'll continue to work on it. And if you're just going to wait for the university to express its solidarity with what you do, you're behind the eight ball. So I don't have that view of things, that there are reasons that Schaefer was able to do that or cared to do it, and there are equal reasons why subsequent people didn't.
Right.
And I don't really think it matters. It hasn't affected anything we've done because we haven't relied on them to fund us to do that.
Right. No, that's fine. And I think that what you've been saying leads to another question we asked, and that is the importance of institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, the Udall Center is an institution, but as you've made abundantly clear, it's based on the action of particular people.
Yeah.
You know, and Dick Camp established a bunch of institutions,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't exist without Dick. And
That's
we talk
true.
about transitions where people leave.
Mm-hmm.
The Udall Center is a good example where the transition was handled really well.
Yeah.
But in your looking at institutions like Beck, the NADBAC, IBWC, and we've seen changes in the leadership of that, how would you evaluate the relative influence of these institutions and the importance of establishing them? Without that, there'd be no BECNAT or NADBAC or BECNAT or KECNAT. So, you know, they provide a framework and so on. But as compared to the energy of people, how would you?
I don't know if this is in the category of events, but what I alluded to before, with the complete 180 degree turnaround of the foundations, that was a double whammy because that happened just before 9/11. In fact, I remember in the spring of 2000, I was invited to give a talk at the Hewlett Foundation by the brand new president at the time, Paul Brest, and there was still some hope in the spring of 2000 that they were going to put some big money into the border. They were interested in some of those trades of water across the border with Packard, and they just bailed out. Ford bailed out. And, what they might have done is that they might have seen, particularly after 9/11, that with the government pulling out of this thing, they had more of an obligation, but they didn't. So I personally regret that. And there is an instance of where personalities do make a difference, because we saw night and day, the minute that Norm Collins left his post in Mexico City, the new guy, Pablo Farias, had no interest in the northern border. And he's now one of the senior vice presidents at Ford. So that continues, that lack of interest continues. And we thought that when Susan Beresford would become president, she gave that talk, and I think you were there when she gave it, weren't you?
Yeah.
She gave a talk that led us all to think that Ford was in this for the long haul. And then Norm left in, I guess in 96. And that was it. Pablo just never had any interest, and his thing was to throw a bone to the community foundations and to say, we gave it the office, they created a pool where all of the foundations contributed. They set up this new fund, and that was great. If you were a community foundation and you needed $1,500, for a blood drive or something, but it didn't do anything for the kinds of work that we were doing, and others. I mean, not just we, but all of the beneficiaries of the Ford.
Another role that you played that has been progressed over time in the border is with the grasslands.
Well,
Tom
yeah,
was
a
the one that
little bit.
But that Common Grounds came out of here, and that then evolved into
Well, I'll tell you what the Common Ground came out of, and it had nothing to do with the Grasslands Conference. I mean, the Grasslands Conference was one of these examples of where early on in the life of the Udall Center, groups would come to us and say, we're doing something, would you give us $500 or $300? And we said, sure, and we continue to do that. And those things are not at the center of our agenda, and we don't necessarily go out and do those events, but we're happy to, lend our name to it. So I think we've supported, I think, 3 of those grasslands conferences, but they're peripheral to the things that we've done. But as far as the common ground, what that really came out of was that the idea for that came just at a time when we were mobilizing to set up a conflict resolution program here, because we were instructed to do that from the legislation of the Udall Foundation. One of the tenets in there, one of the clauses was the Udall Center shall have a center for conflict resolution, for environmental conflict resolution. And when I first looked at that, right after Helen left, I said, well, we've got to do something because it's in the bill. And what's the best thing to do? Let me survey the landscape here on campus and see who's already working on environmental conflict resolution, put out a call for proposals, and say that I have a little bit of money to hand out, which is what we did. And so Tom, who at the time was working with Chuck Hutchinson on this larger ranching issue, was one of the people who put in a proposal. And so we were able to give him, I think, $10,000 or $15,000 from the Udall Foundation money. And there were 2 other groups that got money. One was Bonnie Colby and Tamara Destray, who were working on water conflict, and the other one was Robert Glennon and Tom Maddock, which was really the start of Robert Glennon's long interest since then, in doing his books on water conflict, because he hadn't really worked on water previously. So that enabled us, that little bit of extra money, $30,000 or $40,000 that we put into that, allowed us to support Tom, which led to his then longer-term interest in the ranching and the book. And at the same time, it also led some of the ranchers to come to the Udall Center and say, we've got this issue with the environmentalists, and what if we had a bunch of meetings and you guys facilitated that? And so we did that for about 3 years. And Tom was instrumental in putting us together, and so was Chuck. Because Chuck knew some of the people, Bob Sharp, who ran the Green Ranch, well, not the Green Ranch, the other ranch, the other big one down in Santa Cruz. So we did that as part of the work on environmental conflict resolution.
As you talk about these connecting roles that the Udall Center you have played, it occurs to me that you've mentioned some characteristics of people who are good networkers and are able to move across these borders. And language is one of those. I remember when you and I used to have a common Spanish class. You mentioned earlier that we took together, so that's part of it. Another is the willingness to bring in other people and share the credit. Are there other things that you think that you talked about the proactiveness, the not waiting until the resources come to you.
Seed funding.
Are there other things that?
Well, I think one of the strands that's run through all of this is this idea that the public should be playing a role in decision making about its own environment. And I know when I first came here and started thinking about that, there was a part of that bothered me, because I do believe in a federal government, and I do believe in the good of the government, and I was a little bit afraid of allowing too much power to local communities, because they tend to be very, let's say, right-wing, or they're capable of being very right-wing and into themselves and not being interested in the common good. So I had to kind of get over that and convince myself that in spite of that, it was a good thing for communities to have a voice in their own affairs, and to have a certain amount of trust that on environmental issues at least they might do the right thing. And I think that that's been a continuing strand. We've always been interested in that. We're still interested in it. We still push the whole stakeholder thing. We're very into that with the climate work that we do, with getting information to the right people and making sure that the environmental groups and the community groups are part of this. So I think that that's an important feature of the Udall Center. And I think it's true as well, although quite different on the Indian side of things. I mean, they would be dead in the water if they didn't work collaboratively and completely involve Indian communities in what they do.
Is the Udall Center then unique within the University of Arizona, or do you see other centers or institutions here on campus with similar capacity? It sounds like you don't get any administrative support from on high, so it's not like you've got...
the word unique is always overused, but I'd say that it's unusual because most of the other centers or units tend to have a more purely academic mission, whereas ours is just as academic as anyone else's. We publish as much and in as good places as anyone else, but we also still feel like we want to have that connection. So other than extension, which would be the other analogy, I think that most of the units would not be like this. So it's somewhat unique. And as far as the funding, we do get, don't get me wrong, we do get support from the university, but what we've been able to do, and starting already with that very first year in 1989, is to more than match that support. And we're now up to a point of where, for the money that we get from them, we match it more than 6-1.
Ooh.
Which I think is also, it's not unique, but there aren't, particularly in the social sciences, it's going to be very hard to find a social science institution anywhere across the country with that kind of a ratio.
Have you played a role cultivating the younger students in Mexico? Do you have fellowships or scholarships or people doing their work here that then go back?
This is something that's hit a wall right now with this new or whatever it is, HB 1070? SB 1070. That's been a real problem because the university had just negotiated a deal with CONACYT to have a bunch of students sent here, and that just got killed.
It did.
Yeah, it just got killed. They're hoping to be able to resurrect it, and they're saying it's not completely dead, but the emanations from the Mexican central government are that stuff is all dead right now. And Joaquin Ruiz and the president are trying to say, hold your horses, maybe it's not dead, but they've gotten communications saying that that's not happening. Now, one of the big developments for the Udall Center is that we hired Laura Lopez Hoffman 2 years ago in a very nice arrangement with the School of Natural Resources and Environment. And I know that Peggy suggested you talk to her, and you should. You already have.
Yeah.
Well, one of her goals is to mentor Mexican students, particularly female Mexican students. And she has set that as a goal for herself. And she's got one right now, Kimberly Baez, who's working for her as a doctoral student. And she's going to do more of that, so we're going to look to her to do it. As far as one of the things that Robert Meredith has just done, you may have seen, are you on the listserv? Yeah. So you saw the thing that he recently did about students. We now have 20 students here currently. Now, I don't think many of them are Mexican. Over the years, we've had a few. It's been difficult because of the funding arrangements. There aren't that many Mexican students who come here to do graduate work in that field. I tried to hire Yamilet Carrillo some years ago, back at this time, during the time of that conference, and Bill Shaw wouldn't let me hire her. He had his hooks into her. And she's another one you should add, Yamilet, because I think she's either just finished or is about to.
We have talked to Bill, and he has really made a great specialty of attracting.
He has, right. And of course, it's different because we put students on projects. They put students through a 5-year PhD program. So you look for that kind of thing more in the line departments that do the teaching. But if we're lucky, we hang on to students for 2-3 years. and we give them really good training, and they work with us on projects, they do meaningful work, and then we publish with them.
Right. You know, I don't want to drop the narrative yet. I'm getting a little nervous, and in the sense that you've taken it up to this turning point, which is 9/11.
Yeah.
And the sort of fading in performance and resources of these institutions.
Yeah.
How do you view the future, Bob? There's some people who are very optimistic, saying that it's always thus. We've always had the ebb and flow of our relationships when economic downturns come. And we used to hear people doing Mexican research who would tell us about the past.
You know, that's a really good question, because I'm a knee-jerk optimist. So, I mean, in the big picture, I call myself a cynical optimist, because I'm as cynical as anybody you'll ever meet. But I'm very optimistic about the world, about things in general. But you have to separate short-term optimism with long-term optimism. So I'll buy what Helen just said about long-term optimism with ebbs and flows, and we're definitely in an ebb. And it's going to be a big climb to get back to where we were 10 years ago. Because what I was talking about, it's not just 9/11. One of the things 9/11 allowed our government to do was to conflate the threat of terrorism with the threat of illegal immigration and drugs. And that's a terrible thing, because in my mind there's no connection. And yet the public is convinced that the reason for all these walls and weapons and all of that is that they're going to come across the border and bomb us or something, instead of just coming to mow our lawns or, pick our vegetables. So that's been a real problem, that mixing up of the threats. And then the other major event that I see in this set of points is that when Calderon became president in 2006, he immediately declared war on the narco industry, the narco terrorism. And I see that as a horrendous mistake, because what that's done is it's obviously upped the ante, and the level of violence on the narco front is unparalleled. I mean, it's orders of magnitude bigger than it ever was. And of course, I've always been really cynical about the attempts to interdict drugs and whether that's had any impact at all. And I've always felt that it hasn't. And if anything, it's increased the flow of drugs. So I think that that's been terrible, because now, on top of everything else, everybody's worried about narco-terrorists coming across the border, and again, that gets conflated with the immigration problem. So that, culminating in the Senate bill, we're definitely at a low point. And when things conspire that way politically, it's very hard for these environmental agendas to get any traction or funding, because everybody's focus is somewhere else.
So what good stuff has been enduringly left on the landscape of politics and binational relations by the 20, 25 years?
Well, one thing I see, and I see a lot of this, when I go to meetings across the border, and I look at the colleagues that we work with, and these for the last 8 years have been on water and climate, because I've had this series of NOAA grants and the grant from the Inter-American Institute. And so we've convened these fairly large workshops. The last one was the one that Peggy organized 3 weeks ago. I'm just really impressed with the colleagues and the level of collegiality between our people and the people on the other side. The politics doesn't come into it at all. Everybody said to us here, "You're going down to Mexico?" This was 2 weeks after the bill passed, and everybody was crazed and incensed. And our response was, we didn't think we'd be affected by it. And we were completely right. I mean, I brought it up because I made the welcoming comments, and I felt that it would be the elephant in the room. So I said something to the effect that we're all embarrassed by this, and this is not our politics, and we want you to know that we're with you and that we don't believe in this stuff. And that it was good. It cleared the air, because for the next 5 hours or 6 hours, it was just like having a meeting anywhere else, and people got along, they respected each other. I think that over the years, with better educational opportunities, the cadres are better trained in Mexico. They're more able to converse on an equal footing on technical issues than when I first got into this. So I think on that's the grounds for the most hope. That above the fray, at the places where the academics and even the government people talk to each other, you don't notice any of that. They know that it's politics. So we had
government people. Have you got any sense? I haven't talked to Steve Mummy for a while about the IBWC SELA and its state at this moment.
You know, I've talked to him about it recently, and of course he was a bit surprised at who got named in both cases. He was surprised that it was Roberto Salmon, and he was also, I think, surprised at Drusina being named. I don't know if he's been able to, you know, we were hoping to get him here, and he was supposed to come just when he had his accident.
Yeah.
So he had to postpone it. We're hoping to get him here in the fall. One thing I should point out is that I've had a correspondence with him recently where I had the idea, and this was one of the reasons I fished out the white paper. I'm sure we all did because it came up on BECnet. There was a solicitation by the Border 21 people to come up with suggestions and ideas. And my idea was to convene another meeting like the one that was held here with some of the same people plus some of the new people, and to come up with another 2-3 page white paper to submit to them saying that these are some of the ideas for how you need to look at your next border plan.
I don't suppose we can possibly make that at the same time as Al Utton comes over for a Lobos game. Do you remember?
I do remember.
That was an important
That was the last time I saw him.
Meeting. Yeah.
At the Lobo game, and I got 2 seats by calling Nancy Yaeli at the alumni office, and that was the last time I saw him.
Right.
No, we can't do that, but I thought that that's something, even if there isn't a physical meeting, because the deadline is in late August for getting the comments in. I think if we could circulate a draft and get, you know, any number of people
It's a really good idea.
to sign on, when I told Steve that, he said, "Wow, that's a great idea. I had thought of writing comments, but I realized that they wouldn't get nearly the attention that something like that would."
No, that's a great idea. And it's also an indication of the impact of long-established border voices.
Yeah, I think that's
Because it
true.
embodies Al's voice.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true, and that's what I was thinking of, yeah.
And they're carrying those
Yeah,
ideas
right. I mean,
forward.
he's
They
no
have
longer
a
with
lot-
us, but that whole spirit of what he was attempting to do.
It's interesting. One of the things that I reflect on in hearing that is the transparency is so different. The level of commitment to public participation is so different than it was when I started in the border
Yeah.
those years ago.
Yeah,
It's expected, and there's just no question on both sides of the border, not just on the one. Francisco Zamora was talking about their Upper Gulf work and how really for the first time NGOs are at the table and they won't even begin until they get there. You know, it's like
yeah, that was
There's a role in
unthinkable in Mexico.
it's absolutely unthinkable.
And they're still struggling with that. I mean,
when they had the opportunity
they're still
to
struggling. I mean, you know, they still have this notion of consejos de Cuenca, but a consejo de Cuenca in Mexico is a group appointed by CNA
Right.
to official positions.
Right.
It's not a bottom-up group of people who live somewhere and say, hey, you know, we need to look after our basin.
Right.
So they still have a ways to go. But I agree with you. I think it's come a ways since the early 90s.
Have we got parallel indicators of the state of the natural world? Do we know that some things are better? One of the nice things about the Great Triangle that we began with
Yeah, is
here
that we knew it was
is
better.
that
Yeah,
the skies cleared up.
right.
like,
Yeah, that's true. Do we have indications? Well,
Yeah, how's the Upper Gulf
you know,
doing? Do you know?
I think it may be doing a little bit better. I mean, according to Carl, I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to him
No,
yet,
we will
but
next
you
time.
should. He'll tell you, I think, that it's doing better. because of that notion that Ed Glenn had, that it's not just how much water, but it's when you do the water, that if you do it at the right times, it really doesn't take that much to get things back. So I think they've made some progress in that.
Do you think the reason, like the Biosphere Reserve, without that, we wouldn't have made the strides in this case in the Upper Gulf?
In the Upper Gulf?
Was it necessary?
That's a tough one, because that gets to the question of what should be the balance between formal and informal events. And I mean, I guess I'm conditioned to think that you should, again, it's the same thing as the funding. You shouldn't have to wait around for the countries to negotiate things diplomatically for progress to be made. But if that kind of progress can be achieved, it's of course a good thing. So I think, the fact that there is a biosphere reserve clearly helps. It elevated the stature of that area for Mexico by thinking of itself as having an international reserve.
Well, we've also heard as a result of it being in the UNESCO system, it's also been a place for resources from Mexico.
Yeah, that's what I mean, that once you achieve that status, then it's easier for the people who want to argue for more resources to get them. Now, another person you should add to your list is Ernesto Enkerlin. He's a good friend of Ezequiel's. And in fact, Ezequiel was going to invite him to be a fellow at Mexis for 6 months. I just saw him. Yeah, I knew you had. I just saw Ernesto again because I was invited to do a talk by Ezequiel when they had that exhibit of border wall photos. And Ernesto was the other one who was invited, plus the woman who did the photos. So this is something that he had just put together. So he was named by Fox as the president of the commission in December 2000, and he served for 9.5 years. He's a really good guy. He has a PhD from the University of Texas in ornithology. And he really knows the area. So he's been very supportive of the Upper Gulf stuff. I first met him because
you have his contact?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I have his email address. He and I were in the same Hewlett group because at the time that Hewlett was still trying to decide what to do, they formed a group of university-based centers on environment. I don't know if you knew this.
Yeah, I think it was
from
just as I was
between 2000 to 2002.
Yeah, right.
And it included Patty Limerick at the University of Colorado, and it included the University of Texas, all kinds of places. So University of Wyoming, Montana. Dan Kemmis was part of that originally. Yeah.
Well, it's a shame that they pulled out.
Yeah, definitely. So I met Ernesto just before he was named to his position back then, when he was the director of Pro Natura for Northeast Mexico. And he was also a professor at Monterrey Tech, where he still has an appointment.
That would be wonderful for us.
Yeah.
One of the things that you did very nicely in this interview is talk about the changing agenda of foundations. And you're one of several people who've talked about getting things started and having a kind of financial rug pulled out.
Yeah, but I guess from the beginning, we realized that you don't want to put all your eggs in the same basket, and you really need to diversify.
Having spent 2 years on this proposal, only to have.
Well, that's true. That's true, but I mean, we were definitely, relying on Ford for many years. But the more credibility you get, the more you're able to apply for other things, and so. You do this here and that there, and next thing you know, you've got 6, 7, 8 different sources of funding. And if one of them dries up, you've made up for it. That's not everybody can do that, but it's what I always tell the younger people too, that it's the same with publishing. You've got to publish, because if you want people to know who you are, they've got to be able to read your things, and then one thing leads to another. So it's a combination of doing a project, doing good work, publishing stuff from it, and then applying for another project with a different agency or organization.
Well, you've certainly been
So-
successful at that. It's been an amazing ride.
Yeah, it has been. It's been great, and I've really enjoyed it. And,
Proud to have been associated with
Yeah.
the beginning in it and in
Yeah, so
all
am
of
I.
what it's become. It's really, really wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. It's always fun to talk about this because a lot of people ask me this kind